Chapter 6. Sign Language. The Indian stood quite still. He did not lower his upraised arm or throw the rock he held. "He's weird," Bess whispered. For a few seconds the campers continued to stare at him, fearful of his next move. He was muscular, and though the Emerson football players felt they could put up a strong battle, they wondered if he might defeat them by some unusual strategy. Nancy was the first to make a suggestion. "Let's try to be friendly and approach him with our hands outstretched." Bess was not so sure this was a good idea. Suppose he's from outer space," she said. "There's no telling what magnetic power he might have. He could mesmerize all of us." This struck George as a funny idea. She said, "Oh, sure, and a killing bolt of electricity may come shooting out from his body at any minute. Zzz, look out." Bert muffled a chuckle, adding, "Do you think that's his spaceship down in the swamp? He looks too big to live in it." Bess knew they were teasing her, but ignored it. She had seen the Indian before the saucer arrived. Then a thought struck her. Maybe the spaceship came back for him. He might even be planning to kidnap us and take us away in it. As the Indian continued to stare at the group, Dave glanced at Bess, as if reading her thoughts, and exclaimed, "Watch out! He may hypnotize you!" Bess made a face at Dave, then said, "Okay, Nancy, why don't you and Ned approach the man?" The couple walked forward slowly. Nancy held a shining gold disc on a chain, which she had removed from her neck. Perhaps, she thought, the Indian would be interested in the necklace. Inch by inch, she and Ned continued toward him. The Indian remained immobile. He stared at the jewelry, but did not take it. Finally, he let the rock drop to the ground. Ned sighed in relief. "Maybe he intends to be friendly," he murmured. As Nancy stepped closer, she smiled and said, "Hello." The girl detective repeated the greeting several times as she and Ned came right up to the man. He still did not move, but just looked straight at them. Would he attack? The onlookers watched with bated breath. Now Ned pointed to himself, saying over and over, "Ned, Ned, Ned." Finally, the Indian gave a slight smile and then pointed to Nancy. Ned complied with the sign language. "Nancy, Nancy." Everyone was delighted and started to applaud, but Jan signaled for silence. A hush fell over the group as the man pointed to himself and said, "Shoso." The campers were thrilled. Again they wanted to clap, but Jan shook her head. She was afraid that loud applause might frighten the man away and send him racing off into the forest. Now Shoso laid a finger gently on Ned and repeated his name several times. In turn, he and Nancy pointed at the Indian and said, "Shoso." He nodded and smiled broadly. He looked up at the sky and said something unintelligible to them. "What's he trying to tell us?" Ned asked Nancy. The young sleuth admitted she was puzzled. "Maybe he'll tell us some more in sign language." Presently, Shoso twirled quickly with his arms above his head. Still the couple looked puzzled. Shoso repeated the motion. "I think I get it," Ned remarked. "He's trying to imitate the windstorm." Nancy agreed. "But I just can't figure out his message." Shoso seemed disappointed and thought a few seconds. Then he leaned down, put his hands on the ground, and galloped about. Suddenly he ran off a short distance into the trees. Nancy snapped her fingers. "Ned, I think Shoso is trying to tell us something about our horses." "We'll soon find out," he replied, "if we use some sign language of our own." He leaned over the way Shoso had done and told Nancy to hop on his back as if she were riding a horse. As Nancy did this, she laughed and said, "I sure feel silly, but if it works, I don't mind." By this time, the other campers, no longer afraid of the Indian, began to roar with laughter. "You two ought to join a circus," Bert called out. George scoffed. "A kindergarten circus." Ned and Nancy played their parts well, ignoring the jibes. Shoso nodded happily and pointed in the direction where the boys had left the horses. "Something must have happened to them. Maybe they've been injured," Nancy exclaimed, jumping off Ned's back. "Or perhaps they ran away," he replied. "We didn't tie them all. We let a few graze." "Yes," Bert agreed. "They may have injured themselves being loose in this forest. I've noticed plenty of trailing vines." "Don't say that," Bess pleaded. "I can't stand to see an animal hurt." Without wasting another minute, all the campers and Shoso rushed toward the spot where the saddle horses had been left. 2 of them were gone. "Oh, what'll we do?" wailed Bess. "I blame myself," Dave said. "I suggested we let some of the animals graze." "We're all guilty," Bert added. "We didn't have to take your advice." Nancy noticed with relief that her lovely Susan B. was still there with Goalpole standing next to her. Unfortunately, the horses Bert and Dave had been riding were missing. Hal suggested that possibly the animals had gone back to the original campsite. Jan said, "I have a hunch they may have rejoined the pack horses." "Oh, I hope you're right," Bess answered. "They have all the food, and I'm starved." Hal said that he was less concerned with their supplies. He hoped that the great wind and the blinding bright lights of the saucer had not frightened the pack horses so much that they yanked themselves loose from the tie ropes. Although the campers had had little to eat that day, they knew their main job was to find the horses. Shoso seemed to feel sorry for the group. He beckoned them to follow him. Bert and Dave rode double with George and Bess. The Indian led them directly toward the campsite where they had left the pack horses. The route was much shorter than the one the group had taken that morning while heading for Old Laughlin's. "Oh, thank you," Bess called to him, then remembered that he could not understand her words. He waved and disappeared from view. Nancy and her friends rushed to the area where the pack horses had been tied. To everyone's dismay, the missing saddle horses were not there. Moreover, both pack horses were gone, and so were the supplies. End of chapter 6.